Good afternoon and welcome to this panel that will look at how COVID-19 has affected journalists' mental health. I am Mia Malan. I'm the editor of the Bekesisa Centre for Health Journalism in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'll be in conversation with four really great panelists from South Africa, the United Kingdom and Kenya. We'll be looking at how much longer work hours, job insecurity, the fear of getting COVID-19, and reporting on the same subject for months have influenced journalists' ability to do their work during the pandemic. On a panel, we have two health journalists from Africa, Joan van Dijk from South Africa and Elizabeth Marab from Kenya. We also have Mira Salva, who is the director of the Journalist Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. And we have Kate Skinner from the South African National Editors Forum. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of them when they make their opening statements. But first, here is how the webinar will work. Mira Salva is going to start off with a 10-minute presentation. And after that, I'm going to ask each of the other three panelists a question for which they have 6 minutes to respond, and we'll then move on to your questions and comments. You can enter your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. That way I'll be able to see them, and you don't have to wait until the question time. You can really enter it as it pops up in your head during a presentation of a panelist. So let's move on to our presentations. As I've mentioned, we're going to start off with Mira Salva. Before, Mira was the director of the Journalist Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute. She was a journalist who worked across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Mira is also the co-author of a study among journalists by the Reuters Institute that showed that 70% of reporters surveyed and who reported on COVID-19 said they were suffering from psychological distress. Mira is going to share some of the findings of the study and also tell us if journalists think there are any solutions to this situation. Mira, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for creating a panel on this incredibly important subject, because I think it's one thing that we need to talk about a lot more. There's a lot of taboos around admitting problems with mental health all over the world, in all professions, but especially amongst journalists, I think. So I'm really glad that we can talk about this openly. What I want to present today is the results of this fine study that Mia mentioned. It's a study we carried out earlier this year, very quickly. I worked with Professor Anthony Feinstein in Canada, who's a psychiatrist as well as an academic, and he has done a lot of work on this area of mental health amongst journalists. He started off studying journalists who covered the Iraq War and basically found that they were coming back with similar symptoms to the veterans themselves of post-traumatic stress disorder. And at the time, this was completely unheard of, the idea that journalists might be suffering in the same way soldiers were from coming back from war zones. And he then expanded that to look at other cases, and that includes journalists who covered the Mexico earthquake, the Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya, as well as the drug wars in Mexico. So I'm going to share a presentation to talk a little bit about the study. It's a study that does not speak for everybody, I know, but like I said, we put it together very quickly and on the basis that something is better than nothing in this field. So if I share my screen, I will go through it with you. There you go. So it's the study is, has lots of different titles depending on who we're speaking to, but for this presentation, I've just called it Staying Sane in Maddening Times, Journalism, Mental Health and the Pandemic. It's a very small sample of 73 journalists, but a representative sample that was surveyed in June 2020. It's very hard to get people to speak openly about mental health and to get a true sense of what's going on, because often the people who do want to speak about it are ones who either feel it'll never happen to them, so they're just completely like, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm fine. Or it's people who've gone through the whole journey and come out the other side. So who've had a breakdown, sought treatment, thought therapy, processed what happened to them, and are then able to talk about it and willing to talk about it publicly. This is actually a very small number. Most people are somewhere in between. Most people are struggling, know something's wrong. They don't know what it is. They're embarrassed to explain it, to ask for help. and yet they are in exactly the category we want to reach. So to reach them, we went to some large media organizations and said, can we do this survey in a way that we will guarantee anonymity to you and to your staff and to all the journalists who participate. So if I seem sometimes a bit cagey, it's just because we're trying deliberately to not out the people, because it's, as like I said, it's very hard to reach these people. We had a 63% response rate for this survey, which is, again, is incredibly high. Normally, when you survey journalists for this topic, you get about 20 to 30% response rate if you're lucky. And what we thought about this high response rate is partly the guaranteeing anonymity, but also this year people are really struggling, and they're struggling alone because we're not in our newsrooms, we're not meeting our friends, we're not meeting our colleagues. And so everything is happening through a screen. So when this survey drops into their inbox saying, would you like to talk to us? They say, yes, please, I really would this time. So if I go through the study, like I said, all the respondents work for large established news media. So I know this doesn't then include freelancers and smaller newsrooms that may not have the same resources to help. But at the same time, it's important to see what the situation is like. And crucially, if journalists in these kind of organizations are really struggling, you can be sure that it's a lot worse for organizations elsewhere. They're all experienced journalists, an average of 18 years experience, and in good physical health. So there were, when we look at mental health, we really were focusing on mental health. About 99% said that, that they felt that they were in good physical health. And only 4% of them were specialist health reporters. So a very small proportion of them had experience in this field. And suddenly, about 3/4 of the people we surveyed by June said, I wasn't a health reporter at the start of this year, but I certainly am now. And as Mia said, what we found as a headline figure is that 70% of those surveyed have suffered some levels of psychological distress, and 26% have what we considered clinically significant symptoms of anxiety. So this isn't just a general nerves before a presentation or the nerves you get as you're hitting a deadline, but real anxiety that impedes your everyday ability to function. And that's because you're worrying all the time, because you're suffering from insomnia, because you have poor concentration, you're constantly feeling on edge. Now, I just want to kind of put a very big clarifier here. We're talking about mental health, and what we're absolutely not trying to do is diagnose people over a computer via the survey. So that's why we worked with a psychiatrist who deals with this. And the wording is such, we asked people, have you had these symptoms? And this is what they said. And then we said, well, these are the symptoms of anxiety. So that's 26%. But what was more striking was the issue of the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder. As I said at the beginning, we have, Professor Feinstein's work has found that journalists suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, but his past research has found that it's people, war correspondents and journalists covering natural disasters and terror attacks. And this is both foreign correspondents who fly in to a zone and report on something and go back, but also local reporters on the ground reporting on what they see around them. And I know certainly with the Mexican earthquake, for example, the Mexican journalists who covered the earthquake and its aftermath came out shell-shocked, both about the experience, but also about the utter breakdown in trust that they felt was happening between the journalists reporting and the people who were really affected by the earthquake, because they just felt they'd never seen anything like this, that they go out trying to report on a story and were just met with utter hostility of like, you are making the situation worse. And I'll talk about this a bit in a while as well. So this is where we are. This is the global front line now. So when we talk about where the story is, at the moment it's in hospitals. This is a ward in sub-Saharan Africa, so it's more familiar. And I think African journalists are more used to the story being the health story being the bigger story. But I think for journalists in Italy, in the UK, the idea that hospital wards are where the story is and people in hospital beds dying in a kind of pandemic situation, it's just very new and very unexpected. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from countries that have experienced pandemics more recently, and how this can be reported usefully by the European countries. So this is where we're talking about where the front line is and why you might be suffering PTSD, because you've essentially been on a war. If you're in a ward and you're seeing people dying, you're seeing your doctors and nurses crying, saying they cannot treat all the people that need help, that they lack equipment. There's a sense of social panic over what's unfolding, a sense of incomprehension. There's a sense of governmental panic. Your leaders are not in charge of this situation at all. This affects all of society, but puts journalists in this kind of high adrenaline state of being. So 11% of the journalists we surveyed who've been covering COVID-19 reported symptoms of PTSD. And these include, these are very specific, they include like recurrent intrusive thoughts and memories of a traumatic event, a desire to avoid recollections of the event, and then feelings of guilt, fear, anger, horror, shame. The shame is very interesting. I'll talk about this later as well, because it relates to a concept called moral injury, where in the course of your work, you're forced to make decisions you're uncomfortable with. And this could be knocking on the door of a grieving family, when you know they want to be left alone, but your editor's told you need to go and get their story. It can be going to try and interview a patient who's really unwell, and you feel that what they really need is peace, but what you really need is a photo of them. So this is where moral injury comes in. It's this idea of working inherently against your principles as a human being as well. But there's also the trauma of COVID-19, which is that it's a story that's happening around you, but you are also part of it. You are also susceptible to catching it. You're also susceptible to spreading it. You also need the equipment that there's a shortage of. Your family are at risk as well. So it's a story that lives within us as well as outside us. And what I just wanted to go into briefly, I won't dwell on this because it's a whole different subject, but why this story is so difficult compared to normal reporting times. So I've done another report on the attacks on press freedom that have happened during COVID-19, because what you've seen is that as well as trying to report on a fast-moving, difficult story, governments everywhere, in the UK, South Africa, Kenya, Philippines, India, have used the situation to introduce emergency legislation that ultimately can make journalism harder. So they introduce legislation that enables the executive to bypass parliament, introduce draconian fake news laws, vastly increase the powers of surveillance. And what you end up with there is a kind of very polarized society where there are now people who believe that masks are the worst work of the devil. There are people who believe that the whole COVID-19 is a conspiracy theory. There are other people who are really using it to target minorities. In India, it was very much implied at the beginning that Muslim communities were super spreaders of the virus, even though there's no evidence. And this ends up with a falling trust in journalists, as well as kind of revoking visas and limiting access. So, journalists find it harder and harder to do their job at a time that society also gets more and mistrustful of them, and the legislation, it gets harder to operate under. So as a result of this, going back to why this is so hard on journalists' emotional well-being, is that 60% in our survey reported working longer hours since the pandemic, and 60% of those said it's because of stories, because of the COVID-19. And this, and then you add on to this the demands for extra childcare and domestic duties that have fallen disproportionately on women and female journalists. You can see that there's a lot of journalists, but especially women, who are feeling under incredible pressure to do more, both domestically and at work, with far fewer resources as well. Talked about moral injury, and this is partly to do with actions about how you deal with an individual, but also partly because they feel they're unable to do their job properly in the absence of reliable information. Because this is another thing that we've seen, is that the data on the number of deaths, on the number of infection rates, is not always consistently reported. It's not given out consistently by governments, and it's hard to kind of get a real sense of what's going on. And journalists are very, very aware of this. And this is a quote from a journalist in sub-Saharan Africa, I think in Botswana, who says, I'm more stressed out because I'm unable to cover the outbreak in my country as other countries in the West have done. I feel like a hypocrite because I'm only allowed to follow what the government tells me to, and I'm not able to shed light on how the rest of the country is handling this outbreak. And this is very true in countries where there is a kind of dearth of good public information. It's very hard for journalists. And because it's such a global story, it's very easy to compare. It's very easy to compare what the figures, what the reliability of the figures coming out of your government compared to the reliability of figures coming out of other governments. Because for once, all governments are kind of, all journalists around the world are kind of interested in the same data from their governments. It's not a situation you get very often. like I said earlier, it's an illness, it's a story that affects us very, very deeply. So at the time, this was in June, and I think a lot changed over the summer, but when we surveyed the journalists in June, 45% of those knew journalists who'd fallen ill, 2 knew of a journalist who died from the virus. I know that's increased since then. I've already, I know personally people who've died, so I know that number has gone up. And just to end, what we wanted to say is, well, what helps? Well, counselling actually really does help, because these are journalists from big media organisations, remember. So 52% of them had been offered some sort of recourse to counselling, and those who received it were much less likely to then report symptoms of anxiety and PTSD. It really made a massive difference. And this can be, the counselling is very lightweight. It can be an hour or 2 via Zoom, but just an ability to speak about it and acknowledge it in a neutral space seemed to make a massive difference. And then the final thing is kind of solidarity. So just understanding that you're not alone, that, this is a common problem and a space to share. Support from your newsroom, from your editors and from your colleagues. Again, this is especially true for women who are trying to work with young children, or people working with poor internet facilities or in very, very hot rooms without air condition. Just a recognition that work, home and travel have changed, and you can't be expected to produce the same kind of work in the same deadlines when we're living in this kind of crazy style. And so I think just a recognition that we know it's hard, and we know you're trying, and we know that sometimes your internet connection is going to go, or or you're going to have to break off to deal with a domestic emergency. That kind of thing helps massively. So I think it's a kind of a unique moment where journalists are under massive pressure, and that since I wrote this report, I've had kind of outpouring of stories from journalists who've read it saying this is what they're feeling. And what we are beginning to see, which is of some hope, is that news editors are taking this seriously as well, and newsrooms are beginning to recognize as well that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mira. Before we move on to Joan, I'd like to ask you, can you tell us in which African countries did you take correspondence from?
We asked the news organizations to put it out amongst any correspondence. So in this case, it would have been South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana, where we got respondents from.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and insightful, and really sets the scene for our discussion. We're now going to hear from Joan van Dijk from Bekisisa. Joan is a senior health journalist at the Centre, and in South Africa, she's known for long-form narrative features on health issues. And during the height of the COVID pandemic, she produced a few of these. And one of them focused on the story of a woman and her children who had to escape domestic violence in a very traumatic way. But COVID brought along with it a huge difference in the way that Joan could conduct her job, because she wasn't able to do these interviews in person. She had to do really traumatic interviews over the phone and over WhatsApp. And being in lockdown herself, of course, meant that the access that she had to support services, mental support services, was limited. So Joan, can you tell us, how did this impact your mental health, and what lessons have you learned?
Thanks, Mia. I've worked on 2 stories about gender-based violence. The one has not been written yet, but I thought it'd be a useful comparison when we're talking about reporting in isolation versus reporting in real life. The first story I did that Mia just described, where the woman was escaping a very dangerous situation, that was in level 5 of lockdown. It was over the phone. It was quite a long interview of over 2 hours. And the second one was in real life. My colleague Dylan and I went to Mpumalanga to interview survivors of gender-based violence and the family members of those who've been left behind when the person had been murdered, for example. And there were some striking differences in my internal reaction that I thought would be useful for this discussion. For the lockdown, the telephonic interviews, I found that it was far easier to take a mental break, which was it's kind of a surprising pro of the isolation reporting. This is very, very intense and emotionally demanding interview, but you are in a kind of a place that you recognize in your home, and you can, it's not like when you're interviewing someone in real life, you really have to engage when they're telling you about the most difficult day of their lives. But over the phone, they can't see your face, and there is more of an opportunity to just take a breath and take a little bit of a break when it was getting too much. On the other hand, the kind of narrative features that we do at AIJC, you need a lot of details. And if you're not there in real life to see the person's reaction to what they're saying, or to see their surroundings, or maybe any kind of physical tics that they have and that you can describe, you have to ask more probing questions. And you end up drawing out more details about the traumatic events, which I found striking when I first started doing these telephonic interviews. And it's for that reason, just as a side note, that you also have to really prepare the person that you're speaking to, that you're going to be asking these kind of questions and why you need the information, and to make sure that those people understand that they can say no if they don't want to go into that detail, because often it's very soon after the traumatic event. But it was when we were in Mpumalanga about 3 weeks ago with people in real life, it's something totally different to sit across from someone who is breaking down because they've lost their daughter. And I think the difference is that you can't look away. You have to be fully engaged when someone is retelling that difficult situation. And you can see, for example, the children and their confusion about that have been left behind, their confusion with the situation. But the interesting difference there is that your reaction after the interview, for me at least, was very immediate. You can't deny that you're having a reaction to this traumatic thing that you've just experienced. Well, during lockdown, the other demands of reporting on COVID were so demanding that I just kind of carried on. Okay, no time to deal with that. I'm just going to carry on. There's so much more to do. So I pushed on until I really started noticing my ability to handle the daily tasks just grind to a halt, and experiencing all those symptoms that we just heard of: trouble sleeping, anxiety, can't deal with like set of tasks for the day, that kind of thing. And it wasn't immediately clear to me what had happened, and I had to trace it back to that kind of vicarious trauma of that 2-hour telephone interview. And out in the field, that was immediate. There was no question about what the reaction was about. I was lucky in that I had access to Zoom counseling with a psychologist, but I didn't have the meaningful social outings and dinners with friends and families that can really help alleviate that kind of stress for me usually. But I mean, all of us face that. And something that I've learned from this, I think, is that it's important to go into these interviews, if you can tell that it's going to be traumatizing, to go into the interview already knowing how you're going to deal with it afterwards. Whether that's therapy or solidarity with other journalists, or a phone call to someone who you trust. And also to know yourself and to know how you react to this stuff, because in my example, I'm already prone to just kind of pushing through and carrying on, and like, I'm fine, I'll just carry on. And that definitely accelerates that kind of feeling of emotional burnout. Then I think there's definitely a gap to train journalists in South Africa, since so much of what we do is so traumatic, the stories that we hear. Just to give journalists the framework to protect themselves, similar to what psychologists use. So not just because we do get training about how to interview people so that you don't traumatize them, but I think there's definitely a gap to do the other way around, to make sure you know how to block yourself off during those traumatic interviews.
Thank you very much, Joan. It was great to hear firsthand from a journalist in the field how you've experienced it. And we're now going to hear from another journalist in the field with a slightly different scenario. Elizabeth Marab is a health and science journalist at the Nation Media Group in Kenya. And Elizabeth works for both print and television, but she also lives with a comorbidity, which makes her far more vulnerable than the average person to falling ill with COVID. And this has had implications for how she's been able to conduct a job as a journalist, because she hasn't been able to interview anyone in person since the start of the pandemic. Now, imagine being a television journalist and having to produce stories and not being able to conduct those interviews yourself. Elizabeth, how is the situation playing out, and how has that affected your mental health?
Mira, I have to say that since March, life hasn't been the same with regards to reporting and covering news for me. And I think it's the same it's something that has also impacted on journalists who have an underlying condition, because once COVID came and the realization that it affected mostly people with the underlying conditions, then the vulnerable people had to be pulled out from the field, me included. So what happened in my case was that when the first case was reported in Kenya, that was on 13th March. That was the last day I had to go to the field actively to cover stories. But ideally, I now work from home. I do my stories from home, but that has changed because you see, before COVID, you'd run to the field and conduct your own interviews, direct your own, the photojournalists, how they would take photos. And many a times you'd also direct the camera people and your subjects who you're interviewing. But now in this case, I have to do all this on phone. Let me point you a picture of how that looks like. So if we have a story that I have to cover at the Kenya Medical Research Institute, which is leading all the research around COVID and other diseases here in Kenya, I'd have to coordinate with my colleagues in the office and hand over the story in terms of who the people who are going to go actively to the field to do the interviews. I'd sort of write down everything that needed to be done, then hand it over through email, and also prepare the communication officers of KEMRI so that there's a coordinated, there's a coordinated interview process without me. But when you do that, then you have to be constantly on phone, waiting to answer many questions from from your colleagues, because the people who you're handing over the questions and giving the directions to, first of all, this was not their idea, so they may not have the interest as much as you'd have it. And the second thing is that as let's say the interest is there, they may not get everything that you needed in terms of cutaways, in terms of some of the questions that you never wrote down and needed answers to. And that impacts on how the story comes out at the end of the day. Because one story, if the story is your idea and you're the person who's executing it, but you have to involve other people who now have to come in to assist you, becomes a bit of a problem. But at the end of the day, the story has to be done, you know. So how has that changed for me in terms of the stories I cover? Today, I had to pull away from active field coverage. Of course, there's that loneliness for the loneliness from not covering the active, the story as it actively revolves and evolves. But I had now to focus more on international coverage that is looking at are all about, and the papers that are being put out by scientists. So you get that your coverage is limited to what to the journal papers and to the international coverage rather than what is happening locally. And if you're to do something that is happening locally, then you have to work with the journalists who are in the office. So how does that impact on my mental health? I think for me, it's just the overall loneliness and feeling of seclusion that I'm not able to do most of the stories that I'd like to do until the situation is resolved. And then just being detached from my colleagues and the other people in the office. You know, there's always that seamless teamwork that comes into play when you're there in person compared to when you're working with someone on phone or virtually.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. That is a very interesting perspective, and I'm sure it's going to make for good discussion during our Q&A time. Our last speaker is Kate Skinner, who is the Executive Director of the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF. And SANEF is an influential body in South Africa when it comes to the development of media policy and ethics in South Africa. And during COVID-19, SANEF has been particularly active with looking at the financial impact of the pandemic on the news media, and the organization has also come up with some solutions. Kate, what is SANEF doing, and how does the threat of job insecurity impact on the ability of Africa journalists to do their jobs?
Thank you, Mia. So yes, absolutely. We're an organization that basically organizes editors and senior journalists and also people in media academics and media trainers. And so, you know, we got a lot of information back from all our members, basically saying, you know, this is a really traumatic situation that we're finding ourselves in, and it's a financial situation. And what we looked at, so we basically, as South Africa, we went into lockdown at the end of March, and we started to see, particularly during hard lockdown, that the media, you know, industry was really having a tough time. And so we basically, the first thing that we did is that we did a research report. And we looked at, like, what are the particular areas in the South African media that have been worst hit. And so we quickly gathered as much information as we could, and we discovered, which was not a surprise to us, but we saw that it was the print media sector that had been particularly badly affected, and particularly little publications across small towns. You know, and these journalists, you know, are not part of big organizations, they're part of small organizations. So we were worried about that. We also discovered from the research that freelancers had also been particularly badly affected. And again, we were worried about this, you know, grouping of people that are already fairly marginalized. We basically got information from SAFRIA, which is the Southern African Freelancers Association, and they basically said that 60% of their members had lost up to 70% of their income. Some had lost up to almost 100% of their income. So the research was the first step, and once we gathered that, we then decided, well, you know, we can't just put out a research report and sit back and think that's okay. That just is not okay. And so we'd never done this before. It was quite scary, but we decided we are going to set up a fund. We're literally going to set up a fund for journalists, and we are going to talk to corporates, talk to donors, and we are going to give small amounts of money to journalists who've lost their jobs, just to hold them, you know, in terms of food, in terms of, you know, data, you know, clothes, some of those kinds of things, you know, just to keep them in the profession and to, you know, just to keep them going. So we basically, what we've managed to do is to actually raise almost 5 million Rand, which has been incredible. And we've had, we've done the first round of relief, and in that we had 227 journalists. So we basically gave out about 1.1 million Rand. We're in the second phase now, and we're probably going to do a third phase and a fourth phase of giving funds out. Some of the final phase will be around actual sustainability interventions. But yes, that has been really, really important. And also what's been interesting is that I have been in close discussion with the head of TAF, Jovel Rantoa, with SAFE, the South African Editors Forum. TAF is the African Editors Forum. And they've all been talking about the fact that actually these kind of relief funds, specifically for journalists, because there are relief funds, of course, you know, for other sectors, but specific funds, you know, for journalists is a good idea. I mean, it's not perfect, it's just tiny, it doesn't, you know, doesn't make a huge impact, but it is certainly a first step. So that was one of the big things we did. The other thing, just quickly to wrap up on, is to say that we also looked at all the different funds around the world and within South Africa and basically to tell journalists and freelancers, these are the things that you can access. These are the funds you can access, you know, if you're in a desperate situation. And we made those available, and we kind of constantly updated those as well. So yeah, those are some of the things we've done, and it's been hard, it's been difficult because we've never done this kind of thing before, but it's also been really good, and we've got some very good feedback.
Thank you very much, Kate. And it's really great to hear that some organizations are thinking of solutions and how to help. We're now going to move on to your questions and comments. If you do have a question or comment, please enter it in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Even if it's not a question, a comment is also good. We have one question so far, and that is a question that's probably best suited for Joan and for Elizabeth. It is a journalist who would like to know, how do you cope with the deadlines that is expected from you during COVID? Joan, you've mentioned that the number of stories that you did really increased during COVID and that there were just more deadlines than normally. How did you cope with that? Tell us, and then we can move on to Elizabeth, who can also tell us how she coped with that in an environment where she had to work from outside of the office.
Yeah, definitely our output increased during COVID, specifically because we focus on health journalism. It was difficult. In the beginning, I think we were all running on adrenaline, and then at some point the adrenaline runs out. But I think for me, it really helped to have very good relationships with the team that I work in. So we had long, like phone calls to try and just like get each other through, which started off with work and then veers off into other spheres, just so that you can kind of have a sense of normality of interaction. So that really, really helped. Otherwise, I think it's just kind of making sure you block off time when you're working from home to retain your sanity in some way, whether that's like a 10-minute stretch and making sure you eat healthily. I don't think I did it perfectly. I think I actually pushed through at times when I should have taken a break mostly. So I would not follow my example in that case.
Okay, so taking more breaks, Joan, that's a great tip, and more regularly. Elizabeth, what is your advice and how are you coping with it?
Well, for me, the deadlines have been the same. Nothing much has changed because if the newspaper goes to press at 8 p.m., you basically need to file by 3 p.m. So the deadlines have not changed. What has changed maybe is me working round the clock to try and meet these deadlines. Because you see, when you're working from home, there are a bit of a bloodline in terms of what hours are you working and what hours you're resting. You find that you mix all together, so you find yourself with burnout on some days, and there are some days that, I'll be honest, I've missed a few deadlines here and there because again, keeping up with the timings when you're working from home is a bit difficult than working from the office.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think something that may link up to that is, Mira, in your research that you did you come across, when you looked at other countries, what they do to help journalists, did you come across interesting forms of support, creative forms of counseling or peer support that helped journalists during COVID?
We didn't focus so much on what support they got. We asked about counselling because we were working with kind of the CEOs of big organisations who were saying, what can we realistically do immediately? And the one immediate thing is we'll pay for counselling. Several organisations, including Reuters, have centred on kind of mental health for issues. And the first thing is basically recognizing people after they come back from reporting a particularly traumatic story, that they have time to decompress, a kind of a story briefing where you get a chance to say, how was it for you? How did you feel? Do you need some time off? Do you need some extra counseling? Do you need some access to some other resources? So I think that's a very simple, immediate thing that can be done, is just to, we recognize when a journalist has delivered on a big story, and often there's a moment after publication that there's a void, and then you pause and you start the next story. But in that void, it'd be really useful for senior editors, especially, to kind of have these conversations with their staff.
Thank you, Mira. I'm going to stay with you because there is a question or a comment from Omara Felix, and they're asking if we can shed some light on personal protective equipment issues. And I was wondering, in your research, if you got any complaints from journalists when they talk about mental health, about the fear of getting infected and not having access to equipment.
Yes. Absolutely, it's a very, very important point. There was a shortage of personal protective equipment everywhere at the start of the pandemic, and journalists were just not seen as a priority for receiving for the necessary equipment. It went, quite rightly in many ways to health workers and to care staff and other frontline workers. So absolutely, there was a shortage. Journalists didn't feel they had the right equipment. And crucially, it depended on the newsroom, but there was some feedback from journalists saying their newsrooms were very slow to recognize the need for social distancing and the need to possibly work from home and not get on public transport and not be crowded into a big press conference just because the president was speaking.
Thank you. Let's move on to Kate. Kate, I have two questions for you. The first one, I'm going to ask them separately. The first one is, you as SANEF has created a fund and you've helped journalists, but as you've mentioned, it is a short-term solution. These journalists still don't have jobs, or their media organizations still don't have a way of financially sustaining themselves for a long time. Have you as SANEF thought about any longer-term solutions? Would it be better, for instance, to give the money to raise lots of money and give it to media houses so that they can employ the journalists, or do you reskill the journalists? What are the things that you've thought about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one because, 5 million rand, on one level seems like a lot of money, but on another one is really tiny. So yes, so the two, probably 3 rounds will be just that relief, but then the next round after that, and also, just to say that the hope is that we will continue to fundraise, so that 5 million won't be the final amount. But it's things like to try and assist particularly those publications that are particularly vulnerable. So some of the small print publications, to try and get them to go online. Not that online necessarily does help in terms of all the sustainability issues there, because there's not a lot of advertising online, but still to assist them with that. Some of the other ideas which have been quite interesting is looking at, for instance, zero rating of data for news sites, and speaking to some of the, the operators there, telecoms, cell phone operators there. Other ideas have actually been really kind of dramatic and quite ambitious, looking at Facebook and Google and the fact that they are taking a huge amount of ad revenue away from online publications, and saying, are there things that we can do to ensure that some of that funding actually goes back into the media sector, talking to corporates and saying to them, don't spend all your funds on programmatic advertising, but rather some going back into the established media, research on that. So I think, it's a very important question. We do have to look at the broader sustainability issues. And the idea is that if the media organizations are stronger, then there's a possibility of more journalists coming in, more people coming back in, and the strengthening of the industry for the long term.
Thank you. The second question is probably one for you and Mira, because I know the Reuters Institute has also done a bit of research on what journalism would look like in the future. There's a question from Abawu, and he's asking, do you see journalism ever getting back to normal? Or has COVID changed the way we operate forever? Do you want to first comment on that, Kate, and then we go to Mira?
Okay, so no, I don't think it's ever going to be the same again. I think, the issue is that, there's going to be probably a lot more online. It's certainly been very, very difficult in terms of the sustainability issues. Journalists are going to have to be more creative. I think it's going to be, in some ways, where it will be good is that those media houses that are doing excellent journalism that is needed, loved, and where audiences are really happy with that journalism, those are probably the ones that are going to be the strongest and the ones that survive. So in that way, there's something good about it. And I suppose that's what we need to do, is we need to, probably there is also space for a lot more solidarity, I think, between publications. And I would say, from my very own perspective, that industry bodies and organizations like SANEF, etc., do need to play a very important role in terms of support for these media organizations. And so I'm hoping more solidarity, really strong publications kind of really survive, but definitely more online. So I think those are some of the things.
Thank you. Mira?
Yeah, no, I don't think journalism will ever be the same. I agree completely with everything Kate has said. in many ways, we're facing an extinction moment for journalism. There is so much financial pressure on media houses, and that's why all these emergency funds have been set up to just get money to media organizations and to journalists around the world, not just in Africa, even in, in Europe, America, Asia, everywhere. So we're facing an absolute crisis that exacerbates things we were seeing anyway. We were seeing a fall off in advertising revenue. We were seeing a switch to digital and nobody really knowing how to make money from it. We're seeing a kind of slight breakdown in trust. So we were seeing all these things, but it accelerated everything. But what we have also seen is that governments have recognized that you do need journalism. If you need to be able to get information out to the public quickly and effectively at speed, the media can do this far more effectively than social media or putting things out on a standing on a stage. This is what journalism is for. It's for getting accurate information across a population quickly. So we're both in danger of disappearing altogether, but also fundamentally looking at what we're for and realizing we're really crucial for society. So it's kind of making those two things work together.
Thanks very much, Mira. And I think that links up to our next question, because from what you're saying, things would get more difficult. It's more likely to get more difficult than to get easier, which will probably just increase the need for mental health support because it will become a more challenging work environment. And there is a question that I think Joan and Elizabeth will be well placed to answer. It is from Ira Dukunda Espoir, and the question is, could you give us a practical way of fighting trauma yourself, since not every media house can pay a psychologist? And I guess if things are getting more challenging financially, there would be less money for mental health support. So how do you do that within your own work environment? Joan, let's start off with you. I think you mentioned a few examples, but maybe you can think of a little bit more. You mentioned breaks. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I think it's again, I think I mentioned this previously, but just good relationships, finding a few like confidants that people that you can confide in. It's very difficult to explain to people who aren't in media what your job entails and why you do this, for example. So if there's another person in journalism that you can confide in, that's really helped for me. And then, don't know if this is maybe, there are so many apps, like calming apps, that maybe you could look into as a really, really practical thing. It's like breathing apps and meditation apps that kind of just to block off a few minutes, even if it's 10 minutes a day for your mental health. Yeah, there's a lot of online facilities as well.
Thanks, Joan. Elizabeth?
I do agree with John, though maybe one thing that I'd add is just take time to unwind and decompress from all the pressure from work. At the end of the day, the stories are here, news is here with us, and everything is changing. So you have to take care of your mental well-being first before anyone else intervenes. So your close friends, the things that you enjoy doing on your free days or with your free time, I think we should encourage each other to take up those things more often, because we often find ourselves engrossed in our work and forget that we have lives beyond the newsroom. So for me, I think I've just gone back to doing some of the things that I had not done for quite some time before COVID.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There is a question that all these questions seem to link today, that I think Mira, because she's done research, and Kate will also be a good person to answer. From Lekan Otufo Dunrin from the Media Care Development Network. I think that's in Nigeria. And the question is, are media houses mental health sensitive? Mira, what did you find in your research? Did you find that was the case?
Possibly we had a self-selecting group, because we wrote to lots of media houses saying, will you participate? And the responses were interesting. A few said, absolutely, we want to know, and we want to help and do whatever we can. A few were saying, oh, we're not sure where this would lead, and so we're not sure. So I don't think there's a universal answer, but I think there are some very, very good ones who are very aware of it, and some who absolutely don't see it as their responsibility in many ways to look after mental health of their staff. They just see that as something external. And that's what panel discussions like this are kind of, and discussions and debates like this are for, really, is to raise awareness, but also to kind of say to journalists, this is something you're entitled to ask for, and put pressure on your newsrooms to ask for.
Okay, thank you, Mira. Kate, what is your experience in your surveys in South Africa? Where are the gaps? As a journalist in South Africa, I'm not really aware of media houses that offer you counseling, very openly in any case. Does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very interesting because, right at the beginning of the year, I went around to a lot of different media houses, and one of the questions that I asked was, are there counselling facilities, and if they are, I mean, do you publicise them widely? Do people know about them? And it was very unfortunate because most of them said, they didn't have anything, or if they did, it was pretty small. And some of the really small media houses and little publications and things said, well, we as journalists, we're just tough. We just push on, which I was like, okay. But the thing which I do think has been interesting is that even in the 2 to 3 years that I've been doing this work, there were less people and less organizations that just said, oh no, we just tough it out. So I think there is definitely a shift around that. The other thing which I thought was really powerful was Sane has got this Nat Nakaza Award, which is about courageous journalism. The last year we had somebody called Quinita Hunter who won the award. And one of the major reasons why she won the award was because she was so honest about her mental health issues. And she was so honest about how absolutely traumatic it was for her to be, as a female journalist, trolled online. And I really like the fact that the panel of judges, and they are actually separate from Sanef, they basically said, she is so brave, she's so young, and she is a very powerful journalist doing very, very difficult work. And she has just been really vulnerable about this. And she literally that was one of the main reasons why she won the award. So I think, things are shifting in the industry and we want more of that. These panel discussions, those awards, and on our undergoing discussions with media houses around that. And maybe just one last thing to say on it. I do think that because it's a very expensive thing to do, to have these kind of counselling services, it might be also useful to look at, different media houses working together, industry bodies possibly like Sanef, maybe assisting with that kind of thing, maybe doing particular fundraising around it. I think there are some interesting things there.
Thanks, Kate. We have a very interesting comment here, and then that's going to end with a question, which is probably going to be for Elizabeth and Joan, because it's about journalists. After that, we probably going to have to say goodbye. We're going to come to the end. It is a comment that says, my therapist suggested I spend less time on social media after a few of our sessions earlier this year. This is hard to do because that is where I go to find sources. And I wonder if any of the panel members have suggestions on how to balance the time we spend on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, which also have an impact on our mental health. Elizabeth, have you got any advice?
I'll just go back to the advice that I gave earlier. Just have some time, unwind, have some time off the screens, all screens, your laptop, your phone, and just take a break and do something else other than being online. But then I agree with the person that with the social media, we find ourselves mostly on Twitter and Facebook looking for all these scientists and looking for the next big story. But then at the end of the day, you have to just have a break. It's hard. I know I'm an addict, but you have to take a break.
Thank you. Joan, any advice from you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment. I had a similar experience this year, and I think my suggestion would be to try and stay away from the kind of mindless, if you have to box them into two different kinds of social media use, be very intentional with, if you're logging into this app, it's to find a source or it's to do this, rather than just scrolling into the the like hateful stuff that happens on Twitter. So yeah, I actually as well left certain platforms in the middle of the pandemic when I was just like, this is too much, but it wasn't platforms that I was using for work. It's like I could choose some of the more recreational ones that are just a time suck and just make you feel awful. And I decided to switch those off for a month or two until I felt better and I went back. So I think it's just about choosing, getting a balance of what you want and what you need.
Thanks very much, Joan. I'm going to end with a comment from Johnson Mayamba. He says, my newsroom has counselling services. However, some of my colleagues feel it is unnecessary and that it is not African to seek counselling. I think perceptions need to change. And I think the last sentence, that perceptions need to change, is probably what encapsulates the essence of this panel, is that while things have started to change, there are more things that need to change, and that will make us open to support. And it will also make our newsrooms open to investing some resources in support. I would really like to thank our panelists, Kate, Mira, Elizabeth, Joan. Thank you very much for sharing your personal stories and your research and your insights. I really think it helps to take the discussion forward and to help to change perceptions. So thank you very much for that. I'm very happy we could have this conversation. For those of you who have joined us and would like to join the next session at 3:30 in about half an hour, there will be a session on the spread of COVID misinformation. The session will look at the challenges and the trends of misinformation on this subject. Please join it if you're interested. And from me, Mia Malan, thank you for joining us and have a good afternoon.